Today we're looking at Veena The Event in the Everyday, which appears in, there we go, in Life and Words. Um, so in this chapter, she's laying out concepts and directions of inquiry that really it takes the entire book to explore. So in a sense, she's describing her research agenda. On the other hand, I just want to look for ways that we can think first about the ordinary and the everyday conceptually and as sites of research, and second, what we might explore in everyday life to see how people repair their relations after a collective crisis. So Veena starts her essay, which also opens the book in which it appears, by saying that she describes how violence arose in the lives of her interlocutors, so those people with whom she interacted in uh, primarily in Delhi, um, as an event that, as she puts it, attaches itself with tentacles into everyday life and folds itself into the recesses of the ordinary. Now, this theme of attachment by tentacles is one that will reappear a little bit later in the essay. It's interesting to see that there's a slight adjustment in the directionality of the tentacles. Make of that what you will. I think it's interesting to reflect on the possibility that this is not a mistake, that she sees this kind of mutual implication. But we'll return to that. So on my reading, one thing we have to keep in view is that the event and the everyday or ordinary are not discrete, clearly bounded entities, the one invading the other, the one attaching its tentacles to the other, simply put, but rather that threats to the everyday can have ordinary origins and, as that shows, ordinary responses. So she explains the general contours of her project like this. She says, "My concern is with the slippery relation between the collective and the individual, between genre and individual emplotment of stories. Thus, I ask such questions as, what is it to inhabit a world? How does one make the world one's own? How does one account for the appearance of the subject? What is it to lose one's world? What is the relation between possibility and actuality, or between actuality and eventuality? As one tries to find a medium to portray the relation between critical events that shaped large historical questions and everyday life." Now, much of what she says here seems faithfully, in my view, to forecast some of the rich insights you would discover in the rest of the book, but it can also seem enigmatic. So, what does she mean by the relation between possibility and actuality, for example? So, a way that I would approach this is through her essay on rumor, in which rumors are radically unverifiable. The kind of rumor she's talking about, panic rumor specifically. But also, they are so ripe with possible immediate implications that one must respond to them. And so the relationship of possibility and actuality, or actuality and eventuality, are tightly interknit, not necessarily in determinate ways, though. So it's the work then of the rest of her book. You could argue, I think, that the entire body of her work to respond to these questions. I just want to focus for my purposes on a particular cluster of concepts that stand out as especially compelling for our task of learning what we might think about, or how we might think rather, about the ordinary and the everyday. There are three that I particularly want to bring out. So the relation of critical events to everyday life, the connection of the voice and the everyday, and the question of what it is to lose one's world. Now, as we'll see, having a voice doesn't just boil down to the ability to speak, to utter phrases. Reciting a script or speaking under duress, these are ways of not having a voice. even as one speaks. A critical event may cost you your world precisely in the sense that you find no way of having a say within it, perhaps because you feel compelled to recite only phrases dictated to you. When Das turns her attention to relations, she stresses first the importance of considering perspective as establishing a field of vision that can recognize the relations of objects that fall within the field of vision, and of the eye that makes that perspective. She doesn't mean this just for anthropologists, of course, but also for those people with whom anthropologists study in the field. This, she suggests, is the relation of the subject to the world. So that as an anthropologist, then, I would be attentive to the perspective, or my positioning, taking a perspective, and how that establishes me as a subject of a particular kind, but also then how the perspective of the people who I want to understand, how that perspective also positions them as subjects at the edge of that field of vision, as it were. These relations are crucial because living within them, that's how we learn about the nature of the world. We learn the world through our relations. In particular, we will learn the world as we learn language from those around us. But further, we can discern we can only discern the connection of concrete relations and abstract patterns of sociality from a perspective. So what is the relationship between concrete relations and abstract patterns of sociality? We will learn that only through perspectives, our own and those of the people with whom we study. Now, in parentheses, she adds a note for later discussion, and I find this simply too important just to pass over, so that the parentheses may make it appear as if it's simply an aside that we can kind of treat lightly. I think maybe the parentheses are deceptive here, that maybe they actually signal that something really important is going on. And so these parentheses, in my view, dispel any sense that the relation of the subject to the world from this specific perspective of the subject is transparent or unproblematic or reliable source of assurance. So what does she say? I see the problems of uncertainty, doubt, and skepticism as embedded in the concreteness of relations. If I come to doubt such things as my relations to my parents, the fidelity of our love, or the loyalty of my children, these are doubts that put my world in jeopardy. The everyday, then, in this description, isn't a refuge from doubts and fears and skepticism that threaten my world, but it is just where I must address them. That's where they appear. That also is where I find the resources to engage them. Now, I flag this also because as Veena Das is explicit about, she relies heavily on Stanley Cavell and on Wittgenstein, but it's Cavell I have in mind in particular here. I've sort of run into a similar kind of thing. When I read Cavell's work, I often find that what appears in parentheses are the most stirring and bracing moments in his writing. So I see that something of the same is happening here. In any case, moving on. Wittgenstein, she explains, thinks of the subject not as belonging to the world, but the limit of the world. So then this aligns with what she's just been saying about perspective. As the eye defines the visual field by standing at its limit, so the subject defines the limit of the world. But given that, quote, the subject is the condition of experience, end quote, and that this condition is one of constituting a limit that is not fixed, subjectivity in this view has no specific starting point, nor is ever finished or closed, so that if we're to think of ourselves as constituted as subjects, we shouldn't think of that then as if once we're subjects, that's it, we're done, we're subjects forever. No, that rather this is shifting, uncertain, has no particular starting point, and is open-ended. Where the previous section discussed subjectivity as a limit or as the experience of being a limit of the world, this section employs the idea of the fragment to think about inhabiting a world in which an imagination of a whole, say as something complete, is elusive. So she describes this as inhabiting the world in a gesture of mourning. Something that I find helpful is Cavell's comparison of photographs and paintings in The World Viewed. There he writes, a painting is a world. A photograph is of the world. Okay, so we can always ask, he explains, what lies behind or beside something in a photo. We can always ask what's outside the frame. We could think then that the photograph might be something like a fragment. There's no apparent way that we could extend the frame to get the whole, whatever that might be, as if we could get to a point where there's nothing that lies outside the frame. Now, because Veena Das examines violence in this book, there's a particular resonance to the idea of re-inhabiting a scene of destruction, which is the theme she picks up from Cavell and Wittgenstein. Violence, of course, can have this dislocating effect within the life of a community. And in the course and in the aftermath of violence, the members of a community have to figure out how to go on in this scene of devastation. It might be physical devastation, it might be social devastation. So we might see how that looks like re-inhabiting a world in a gesture of mourning. This theme again. Mourning, say, the life that was destroyed, along with all of the possibilities of that life, which are not simple to place in the past as something done, as like a closed chapter. Why? Because the devastation can continue to haunt everyday life. So by way of analogy, I'm not sure if this is a perfect analogy or not, but nonetheless, think of, if you want to get a handle on this idea of mourning, think of the realization that we can't live without doing violence globally, not just to one another, but to the world we inhabit. We may find then that we can persist only in a state of melancholy. So then perhaps this is something like an example of life in mourning. Mourning at having lost an ethical aspiration to live non-violently. Arguably, though, this would not be the end, but rather the start of our thought and practice of ethical living and ethical agency. The relationship between language, voice, and the everyday, this is not a straightforward relationship. This is complicated. So one's voice, as I have said before, does not just boil down to being able to utter words and phrases. The notion that our words have lost touch with life is one way that language can, in fact, stifle voice. So if we're to think back to the examples that I gave, if we are compelled under duress to speak certain words, you can see that as a particular way of stifling the speaker's voice, that the script moves through the speaker, but not, as it were, in speaker's own voice. So then the possibility of speaking, but not in one's own voice, is a way that skepticism may be embedded in the ordinary. As a bit of sort of stage setting, in another book by Cavell, Contesting Tears, he wrote in terms of having a voice as having a voice in your own history, so that, he says, the denial of voice is not the loss of speech, a form of aphasia, and a loss of reason, of mind, as, say, the capacity to count, to make a difference. So to make a difference in your own life, to count within your own life. We could then think of it like this. A life in language is a definitive aspect of the human form of life. We'll talk more about form of life in a moment. Language is of necessity shared, it's public, it's social. Finding my voice in a shared, public, social language is establishing my place in the world, which is a continuous, not a one and done project, as subjectivity is never a completed project. There's no sort of terminus at which you can say, okay, I'm finished now with my project of being a subject. This is the same thing, that having a voice, maintaining your voice in a language that you share with others is an ongoing project. It's one that can be thwarted, one that can fall into disarray. And finally, then, I have to do this with words that are not mine alone. Necessarily, I have to do this with words that are not mine alone, but rather that are shared. So if my voice is a connection to the everyday and appears only in the language that I share with others, then my connection to the everyday is also my connection to others. This is why the threats to my voice, whether they come from without or within, the threats to my trust in others, and in, say, the trust that I can place in them speaking in their voices. These are the points at which skepticism and doubt can arise, not just about others, but about myself as well. Das, though, explains that my connection to others as acknowledgement rather than knowledge of the other requires, as she says, repeated attention to the most ordinary objects and events. Again, this notion that there's no finishing this work, that this is work that must be repeated. It's an ongoing project. And that is why skepticism can emerge within the everyday, not necessarily as the product of a critical event. Now, to go back to Cavell again, he explains this as disowning knowledge. He does this in plays of Shakespeare. If the relationship between my voice and the language that I use to express it is nebulous, leaving me with doubts about myself, then what am I to make of the voice of others? So Cavell would invite us then to consider King Lear's doubt about his daughter's expression of love, or Othello's doubts about Desdemona expressed as jealousy, or Macbeth's uncertainty about his wife's humanity. That these are the ordinary ways in which skepticism can take hold in our lives. In these sorts of examples, and the ethnographic ones Das shares in her work, we can start to see how what she calls world-annihilating doubt can arise not only through big events, but also in modest and ordinary ways, as I've just said. So a case of this would also be the films. There's more than one filming of Gaslight, and Cavell again writes about that in Contesting Tears. Importantly, then, we can see how others' words can induce doubt in us, not simply doubt about the rest of the world, but doubt about myself in this world. Is the world I perceive the world that exists? Do I have a sound grasp of the world? Can I trust my own perceptions? So then, through this, she says, or he says rather, that we can be victims of language, as if words could reveal more about us than we are aware ourselves. That's from Dass's essay. The way that concepts of event, voice, everyday, skepticism converge then is complicated. This is not a straightforward set of relations. So I want to consider then just a specific arrangement to bring out what I see to be at stake in this chapter, but in Dass's work more broadly. If having a voice is a crucial part of my finding myself within the everyday, it is also under persistent skeptical threat from within the everyday, because skepticism can emerge there, as we just talked about. And if critical events should take hold in a community's life, this is another source of this sort of disruption of the relationship of my voice in the everyday, my access to the everyday. So neither threats arising from the everyday or threats arising from critical events, necessarily robs one of speech, but may imperil access to voice and hence capacity to orient oneself within the everyday. So if you were to consider what it would be like to speak only scripts that others had prepared for you, then I think you can imagine how that would feel like you were losing your place within your own life, within everyday life. So I want to take a brief detour to approach this from a different angle. In his essay, Self-Reliance, Ralph Waldo Emerson outlines the risk of conformity. He thinks he doesn't use the language of voice in the same way, but I think hopefully you can see the parallel here between acting in conformity and loss of voice. So he says, most men have bound their eyes with one or another handkerchief and attached themselves to some of those communities of opinion. This conformity makes them not false in a few particulars, authors of a few lies, but false in all particulars. Their every truth is not quite true. Their two is not the real two, their four not the real four, so that every word they say chagrins us. Now, this passage, to my mind, captures something of what I take to be important about voice. My voice is not a private or psychological state. I find or establish my voice among others and maintain it to the extent that I can, as Emerson urges, to trust myself, not know myself, but trust myself and decline the request to conform. Why? Because when I conform, I, in a sense, mortgage my voice. I speak in a voice that others give to me rather than speaking in my own voice. I express myself in words that I share with others, which again is always a potential source of skepticism about whether the words that I speak are in my voice or are in the voice of another spoken through me. But what Emerson wants to promote is the idea is that even as I speak these words that I share with others, I can do so without accepting scripts that are prepared for me, impressed upon me. Now, if events, both big and small, can throw the everyday into a chaos of doubt and violence, how do people re-inhabit the scene of destruction Das addresses this in her fieldwork. She says that life was recovered not through some grand gestures in the realm of the transcendent, but through a descent into the ordinary. There was a mutual absorption of the violent and the everyday, so that I end up thinking of the event as always attached to the ordinary, as if there were tentacles that reach out from the ordinary, from the everyday, and anchor the event to it in some specific ways. So, as I said, we see the idea of tentacles initially reaching from the event to the ordinary or the everyday. Here we see the reverse. Again, I'm not persuaded that this is a mistake. I think that what she might be pointing to is that there's a mutual imbrication of event and everyday, so that in a sense, the directionality of what absorbs or latches onto the other is not always clear. Now, there are subtle and intricate moves through this passage. And when we want to understand the consequences of a critical event, we have to look beyond what we might think of as just the sort of the immediate effects of the event, and see also then the ways that the event can seep into the everyday or can be drawn into the everyday, and that this may not happen um, just right away, that this might be something that endures over decades or generations. How the event implicates itself or becomes implicated in the everyday demands careful attention to, as it were, small things, small acts. This is a lot of what we find throughout Das's work, is this attention to the way that small things, small acts, small gestures speak or bespeak or embody the way that the event has seeped into everyday life. But then understanding recovery from events also demands attention to the ways that people turn back to what social resources ordinary life provides to make life together livable again. So again, an analogy. Hopefully this will be an enabling analogy rather than just a distraction, but here it is. Just as philosophy doesn't have recourse to some other language separate from ordinary language to do philosophical work, so we do not have recourse to some sort of cache of social resources other than those we find in everyday life. Either we re-inhabit social devastation using those resources, or we fail to build a future together. Now, what would it look like to fail or to decline, to recover in the scene of devastation? At the most extreme, we could think of genocide as what an absolute refusal for recovery could look like. But of course, there are many, many less extreme ways in which people may experience what Das calls the failure of the grammar of the ordinary. What does she mean by this perhaps elusive phrase? She means that by which I mean that what is put into question is how we ever learn what kind of an object something like grief or love is. This failure of grammar, or what we may also call the end of criteria, is what I see as the experience of world annihilating violence. Now, to get a sense of where these ideas of grammar and criteria are coming from, I'll quote a brief passage by Wittgenstein, which I think is the primary source for this. He writes, "It is what human beings say that is true and false." This, by the way, is coming from Philosophical Investigations. So it's what human beings say that is true and false, and they agree in the language they use. This is not agreement in opinions, but in form of life. Now, part of what he's talking about is sharing criteria and shared philosophical grammar. So we shouldn't be um, drawn into the idea that grammar here is strictly linguistic grammar. So philosophical grammar. When these break down, the agreement we lose is not like agreement in opinions or a contractual agreement, but it's rather the loss of the sense that the world and others in it are legible to us. Indeed, that I may become illegible to myself. So a classic example of um, sort of a breach of philosophical grammar that is not a breach of linguistic grammar would be to say a phrase like, "It's raining outside, but I don't believe it." Now, there's there's nothing grammatically wrong with that in the sense of linguistic grammar, but there is something wrong with it if we think of what is the grammar of belief. And so you could produce all kinds of examples like this. Um, and this then is the kind of thing that Das is pushing toward in this passage, that should I lose my sense of what the grammar of grief or love is, that throws my um, it throws my world, starting with my social world, into disarray. If I no longer have confidence in the criteria that I can apply to the world, I become disoriented in this world. One result then of such events may be that one becomes voiceless. And let me pause actually just for a moment before I go on with voicelessness to say something a little bit more about criteria. So if I have criteria for what a human being is and what human beings are capable of doing on the basis of that criteria, then in situations of extraordinary cruelty and violence, I may find myself uncertain whether I can convince myself that the perpetrator of such violence and such cruelty is in fact human. How could a human do these things? This is the kind of thing then that can throw my world into question for me. Okay, but back to voicelessness. Such events may render one voiceless. Not, as I say, in the sense that it's impossible to speak, to utter phrases, but rather that the words one speaks seem no longer really to hook into the world. A way that Das puts this is to say that the words become numb or frozen. They are without life. And because language is so intimately bound up with my familiarity with my world, language gone numb or lifeless or seeming to lose its connection to the world is a crisis for me. It's a way that I lose my world or lose access to my world as the kind of thing for which I have criteria that apply. Now, Das concludes this section by setting out the ethnographic task that stems from what she's described. So she explains it this way, that it is to describe how feelings of skepticism come to be embedded within a frayed everyday, so the guarantees of belonging to larger entities such as communities or state are not capable of erasing the hurts or providing means of repairing this sense of being betrayed by the everyday. Community is constituted through agreements and hence can also be torn apart by the refusal to acknowledge some part of the community, for example, women or minorities, as an integral part of it. So we see here that the relationship to community through agreement hinges on the notion of acknowledgement, that it is the withdrawal of acknowledgement from specific others that renders them not necessarily just exiles from the community, but as potentially exiled from the notion of life on the whole. So let me put this slightly differently. One's life in a community hinges on having or finding one's voice within it. If you have no voice within your community, there's a sense in which you cease to count, using Cavell's language. You cease to have a say in your life. And so when others withdraw their acknowledgement of your voice, they're both refusing to see you as a member of the community, and they're declining to see you as the kind of being to whom the community's agreements apply. Now, these are not contractual agreements. These are agreements and criteria, grammar, counting as the kind of thing that we would say is human, for example. Now, much of this section previews later chapters in the book, but one of the key insights it considers is the difference in relationship between showing and saying. These are, again, classic themes from Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. If language is a constitutive feature of the human form of life, it's important to consider how Wittgenstein thinks of language as mainly expressive, with the additional observation that there are non-linguistic modes of expression. Now, one can show pain, as in, say, a grimace, but one can also show it in expressive language. So, to utter the phrase, "I'm in pain," I'm not giving somebody a report about my state, but I'm expressing my state. I'm expressing my pain. Now, the flip side of this, of course, is that language can also be used as a way of avoiding expression, for example, by reciting scripts, so that there are ways that you can speak exactly to avoid revealing the pain that you may be in. As I proposed above, we find in Das's work the idea that even when people cannot or choose or simply do not talk of violence, the violence of a critical event, all the same, they might show its effects, as with the elderly women she describes who wandered the streets where their Sikh family and friends had been killed in the violence following Indira Gandhi's assassination. So they didn't utter the expected, say, conventional laments for the dead, but rather called out the names of those who had died there in the preceding days. We can see here then something that this was a vocalization, but we can understand their vocalizations as showing rather than saying their anguish. Again, the idea that they're not offering a report on their anguish, they're expressing their anguish. Again, this raises this question of how to re-inhabit a space of devastation. So I want to return for just a moment to a point I made earlier about skepticism residing in the ordinary, um, with one additional observation, one that the book as a whole explores extensively. So a critical event, partition, the massive communal violence that targets distinct groups, as in the wake of the assassination of Indira Gandhi, can not only dislodge people's connection to everyday life, but also can awaken or activate doubts or skepticism that have lain dormant or latent between neighbors, within kin networks, or within households. So that, again, the way that a critical event may find expression in everyday life won't be programmatic necessarily, that it can have the power, as I say, to reanimate dormant or latent tensions and grievances. In describing the different ways that masculinity was the imagined stake in both partition and after Indira Gandhi's assassination, partition should have a capital P there, my apologies, the differential risks at which these imaginations of masculinity put women's bodies, Das reflects on how humans not only pose dangers to each other, but also offer hope, that suffering and healing then are enduring potentials of ordinary life. Both of them are enduring potentials. She writes, now, turning finally to the notion of forms of life. She writes, Wittgenstein takes language to be the mark of human sociality. Hence, human forms of life are defined by the fact that they are forms created by and for those who are in possession of language, even as the natural is absorbed within these social forms. So if we want to get a sense of the mutual absorption of the social and the natural, language is the crucial thing to consider. So language is natural to us. Maybe we could think of this as part of our evolutionary inheritance. It definitively informs our sociality, but recursively, our sociality informs our language use. Agreement in language in form of life is not an agreement in opinions then, as I said earlier, but is the condition of sharing opinions or contracts or conventions or traditions or what have you. Now, some anthropologists have taken this idea of form of life from Wittgenstein, and they place greater stress on form than life, right? So that they think form of life, form is the crucial thing to understand for an anthropologist. And this sort of inclines them toward an understanding of form of life as modeled on contract or convention. Now, in Das's view, what we share when we share a form of life is not just the conventions, the traditions, customs, and so forth, but the criteria for what sort of thing a human being or love or grief is. The ordinary and the everyday are social, and engaging in them means engaging with others. We constitute the everyday together, which in turn is to agree in a form of life. As I say, that if we share opinions, agree or disagree in opinions, that only happens on the basis of agreement in forms of life. We can therefore think of form and life as these sort of mutually implicated axes, two axes, form and life. Das says, she takes this notion from Cavell commenting on Wittgenstein. What interests me most in Cavell's writing is the idea that the vertical sense of form of life, that's the one that stresses life, suggests the limit of what or who is recognized as human within a social form and provides the condition of the use of criteria as applied to others. So then why is this an important thing for us to consider when thinking about violence events and the everyday? She writes, the distinction between the horizontal and the vertical axes, that would be, think of life as the vertical axis and form encapsulating things like traditions and customs and so forth as the horizontal. So the distinction between the horizontal and vertical axes of forms of life take us at least to the point at which we can appreciate not only the security provided by belonging to a community with shared agreements, but also the dangers that human beings pose to each other. These dangers relate to not only disputations over forms, so the correct way of carrying oneself in society, the correct ways of performing specific sort of conventional or traditional or customary acts, whatever the case may be. Okay, disputations over forms, but also disputations over what constitutes life. The blurring between what is human and what is not human shades into the blurring over what is life and what is not life. So if we were to think of things like phrases like inhuman treatment, now that is something that we apply only to people who we think are candidates or who are humans, candidates to be human or who are humans. So that this notion of inhumanity is simultaneously something that we can really only consider, or that we really only do consider, with respect to humans. We never consider saying that that cheetah is behaving inhumanly. It wouldn't be that would be sort of an empty statement to make. Um, and so when we encounter a case where we describe someone as acting inhumanly, that is someone who we find to be at our threshold of criteria for describing what a human being is and what a human being is capable of doing. Now, okay, so this blurring, this is a threat then that exists in a multitude of guises. In the everyday, and it's one that, so in the everyday, that one should withhold acknowledgement from the other. This may not be an exclusion just from one's community, but again, this idea of excluding the other from either humanity or from life itself. The final section it's a light revision of the conclusion to Dass's essay, Wittgenstein and Anthropology, which reappears in her book, Life in Words. And that essay, reappears in Textures of the Ordinary. Given her repeated returns to this paragraph over nearly 25 years, it merits more attention than I can give it here. I'll read it and then pick up just a few things that stand out to me about it. So she says, in the preface to Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein writes, "It is not impossible that it should fall to the lot of this work being the Philosophical Investigations, in its poverty and in the darkness of this time, to bring light to one brain or another, but of course it is not likely. In life," said Wittgenstein, "we are surrounded by death. So too, in the health of our understanding, we are surrounded by madness. Rather than a forceful exclusion of this voice of madness, Wittgenstein returns us to the everyday by a gesture of waiting." Quote, this is a quote from Wittgenstein now, from the Philosophical Investigations. "If I have exhausted the justifications, I have reached bedrock and my spade is turned. Then I am inclined to say, this is simply what I do." End quote. In this picture of the turned spade as indicative of a turned pen, we have the picture of what the act of writing may be in the darkness of this time. For me, the love of anthropology has turned out to be an affair in which, when I reach bedrock, I do not break through the resistance of the other, but in this guise of waiting, I allow the knowledge of the other to mark me. So I'll add just one final thing about this. There's what I find to be an intriguing ambiguity in this penultimate sentence. In this gesture of waiting, I allow the knowledge of the other to mark me, which could mean the knowledge that the other possesses. Dass continuously goes back to the notion that the subjects who she describes in her work teach her how to understand their worlds, and therefore how to understand philosophical texts like those by Wittgenstein and Cavell. So it could be that knowledge on the one hand, the knowledge that the other possesses and that she can therefore allow herself to be marked by. Or it may be Dass's knowledge of the other, her separateness, say, that marks her, or perhaps both? Again, it's an intriguing ambiguity, one that I think it's not important to arrive at a final conclusion about it, but rather to let the ambiguity spur us to think further.